All right, so it's week 18. We are on day 3. We have just started React. This week is all about React. So looking back, we've already learned a little bit about what React is. We kind of had an intro to components, an intro, and then I guess last class you got thrown into an intro in both states and props. Today is the real props lecture. So we'll dive a little bit more into props today, but in order to get there, we're gonna kind of do a little bit of a review too as well, because in order to show you props and how they work, I need to create a React app here. So we're gonna kind of walk through the steps to get one up and running and talk about different features of React along the way. So I just have an empty directory here that we're going to start my React app. Does anybody remember how I get one up and running? If you don't, secret key is in day 1 of readmes.
Is it what is it, npm at latest or something?
npm create byte at latest.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. We're going to, oh, does this look right? What's it doing?
You got to name the project.
Yes. So this whole thing's gonna give you a, oh, I guess it has, let's name this. We'll just name it React Sample Project. It's gonna prompt you for a few things. When you spin up a React app this way, it will prompt you for a few selections and everything. There's also different commands you could do that will just spin up an app without asking all this. But we're using Vite specifically, so works with a bunch of different frameworks, I think. So we have to specify what we're doing. So that's where this list comes in. We want to use React. We're teaching React in this. Y'all can play around with the rest of these in your spare time. I know Vue and Angular are also quite popular, so those would be something you can look at, but we want React. And we are doing JavaScript as our base because we're using those JSX components here. Awesome. So I got my React app. I got a project here. And when I drop it down, I see I have my source folder, which is where a lot of the magic happens, some other stuff that we don't need to worry about at this point. And then this public folder, also don't really care about that at the moment either. What is the entry point into this React app? Which file is our main file here?
The main JSX?
Yes, this is the main one. And we can see this is a component, right? We learned about components. So this is calling the app component. And we can see it's importing it from here, this app.jsx. So while this is where our entry point into this happens, you're not really going to touch this file itself. You're going to work mostly in app.jsx. And that's where we'll be doing most of our work and examples. And you can see they have all the general React screen up, which, by the way, is my app running right now? No. I see Jonathan shaking no. So how can I get this up and running? Oh, look, it says done, now run. And it tells us exactly what to do. So sometimes the terminal is great and actually prompts you for the right things. And this is one of those times. So once you've got your project set up, it's like, hang on, change into this directory, into this React directory here. And then npm install, npm run dev. Just memorize those commands. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to change directory, npm install. And we'll work on it. Wait, it's taking its sweet time. It did not take this long earlier today. I don't know what's going on with my computer. All right, good. Now we'll do our npm run dev. And again, we got lots of little keys here on where our application's running out of. It's running out of this port here. So I'm going to just control click and I'll bring it over here and we can see this is what all this is putting out on here. It even has a count thing. So, oh, but that's just an on-click set count. Okay. Cool. So I've got my project set up. We're gonna start working right into our props lecture by, let's see, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all this extra stuff because I don't want to use this little counter. So I'm just going to take it out. I also don't want all these things they threw in there. So I'm going to take those out too. Actually, I'm going to take the whole div. Okay, but I'm leaving these. Does anybody remember why I leave these here?
Because React requires the components or information to be in a tag of some sort, right? Whether it's a div or like that shorthand fragment tag to render it.
Yes. Why exactly does it require it to be in this tag? So that is correct, but what's the reason behind?
It'll only render like the outermost tag.
It'll only take one line, basically. It will take a one line output and render that. But if you have more than one line, like if you have multiple components, so if I just threw in a component here, even if that component had like multiple HTML lines behind the scenes, it'll run it or render it because it's just one line. But if I start adding, a button down here and then something else up top, all of a sudden now it won't be able to run those individually because it needs to be just one line. So by putting this around it, it essentially makes it a one line code, basically, if that makes sense. But don't worry, because if you don't have those, you will be prompted to create that. So we can play around with that. Let's so working in React, are we going to just throw our HTML right in here? What is a best practice, I guess, for React? Are we going to just throw everything within this app? Like basically up here is where we do our JavaScript logic and all that, and down here's our HTML, or what do we use in React to make it?
Components folder.
Yes, we want components, exactly. So you may have just thrown it straight in the source folder, which is okay, but best practice is to go ahead and make a components. Oh, I can't remember if it's uppercase or lowercase. I have to look at that. A components folder. Let me see if I can look that up real quick.
I've been making it lowercase. And lowercase works for sure, but maybe caps works too. I don't know.
Okay, looks like there isn't a strict rule about using uppercase, but conventions are. Okay, that's for the component itself. I just want to know the folder. Okay, it looks like lowercase is what I'm seeing on most. And we'll touch base on the conventions for naming the components themselves. But okay, lowercase, probably just like assets. That makes sense. Again, it doesn't matter, but just common conventions. Okay, so we have this components folder. So what are components and why would we necessarily want to have different components instead of just throwing everything on this main page?
They can be reused.
Yes, perfect. That is like 1000% the greatest reason for components in React is it allows us to be able to reuse these, kind of like we separate out functions that we would want to reuse over and over. We do the same thing with components. So if I had a button, and I know I'm going to use that certain style button all over the place, I can make a component of that button and just plug it in wherever I want. So for example, we're going to be looking at a profile page. So we're going to set up like a profile page with just a name and an image. Easy breezy. So we're going to go ahead and make a new file under our components because we're not going to put anything in here. We're just going to kind of build this page with our components. And I'm going to make something called profile. And it's going to be a JSX file. These are going to be all of our components. We'll use that JSX extension. Now, naming conventions for your components is typically Pascal case. So you will do like an uppercase, and then if it's 2 words, you uppercase the second word as well in there. So I have my profile JSX component. Now let's see if it will you can follow the README for how to set up your component, but it's basically the same thing every time. I don't even know if we have to import React or anything, used to in old ones, but we're going to do export default function. This export default just allows us to call this function elsewhere instead of having a separate line below that says export it. And we're going to name this profile because that's our component we're going to be using across the board here. Now, I'm going to throw in something that we're going to come back to in a little bit and look at more, but I'm going to do something called props here, which right now, for our purposes, let's think of this as parameters. We want to give this function parameters. We're going to give it probably a name and an image, and we want to build our profile, I guess, set up our profile HTML using those parameters. So I'm going to give it props right now. That is what we use to pass down these parameters from a different area in React into this component. And after you do your export default, then you have to return as well. And this is where we will do our HTML part. And again, since we can't really just return plain HTML with multiple lines, we're going to throw this in here too to wrap everything in so that we're covering our bases. So now we can work and do whatever we want in here, and we know it'll be returned because it's wrapped by these little fragment tags here. Okay, so as the README shows, we're going to put in, I'm just going to copy and paste this here, and we're going to talk through this. Let's see, and then I will also move it over where it's supposed to be. Okay, so in order to build this profile, let's say it could be fancy. It could be like a little card or something, and we want to stack it up on the screen with a bunch of different people's names and images. I'm taking these parameters that I'm passing in, and these props are key value pairs that we're going to pass in. And that's how props are set up. They're all key value pairs. So in order to access that information, we can just access it like any other key value pair. We can do this props.name to grab the name of that. So we have a header here, we're going to pass in a name. And then we have an image here, we're going to pass in an image URL. So our idea is we're going to take these props that we have, these parameters that we're passing in, and we're going to just pull the values from those parameters and use them down here in our code. So if I didn't have props, what this would look like, what I'm trying to do, so I could do like this. I could hard code it, we're gonna do that, and we're gonna pass in a profile image right here. I gotta put it in there. Okay, so I could do this, but what's the problem with doing this in my component?
That's all you can do.
That's hard coded, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if we want to reuse this over and over again, this is a horrible idea. I don't want to just stick in this one name. I want to be able to have dynamic input. I want names to be put in here based on what I tell it to put in. So that's where props comes into play. And that's why we're doing that. So let's put that back in. Now, does anybody know why I'm using these curly brackets down here?
That's how you pass in the variable.
Correct. Why do I have to pass in the variables that way?
Is that just JSX syntax?
That's HTML. That to pass in the data.
Like
So
it's interpolating, right?
yes, correct. It's to interpolate JavaScript features down here. So we can do JavaScript up here outside of the return, but we only want to return HTML basically. So in order to interpolate the JavaScript features, and that's why it's this little JSX, it's kind of a combination of both. This is just how you do it, how you interpolate that. So anything we define up here as a variable, we can't just put down here. We have to put it with curly brackets in order to use it within the return. Okay, so I'm going to, so this should be good. All right, I want to be able to pass in our parameters, our props, and I want to pass in a name and an image URL. And then I want them to be, they'll just be placed within this. So now let's go back to our main app. So we're gonna use this component here. We want to make a like a profile image here, a profile page with a name and image URL. So I can call this component, right? I can just plug this component in here in the return. But how would we, well, first let's import it. You can't do anything if you don't import it. So React is super smart. If you just say import profile, look, this first one comes up and says, oh, do you mean this profile component from components profile? And you just push tab. He's, yes, that's exactly what I mean. So it pulls that for us. Now we can come down here and do we can call this component within our HTML. So now this is how you would normally put a component within your return, right? This, by doing this, it's going to look in here, grab all this stuff, and put it within these tags. But I want to give it parameters. I want to give it props. I'm going to use those interchangeably because I know you all are more familiar with parameters than props, but props are parameters. I want to pass it these parameters. How I would do that here is you can literally simply do your key value definitions right within this component. Again, we need curly brackets and we just pass in what we want. And then no comma, no nothing needed. You'll just space and go on to the next key and value pair. Let's see. So this is going to be image URL equals, and then we'll throw in this right here. So now this is saying, let's take that profile component and let's pass in these props, and we can hover and see it's called property. Props is short for property, but they're just parameters that we're giving to this function that we've identified in this component. So now these key value pairs are being passed in here as props. So we can access those by just doing props.name, props.image URL, and the values will be interpolated into there. So let's see if that worked. Save it, not getting any errors down here. You saw while I was working on it, it was throwing all sorts of errors. So that's kind of a good check before you pull up your page. Is this actually going to work? And yay, it worked, except this picture doesn't look like it's loading. we're gonna address that later, but we can see when we inspect it, we can see we don't see props or anything. We see the actual values that were passed into this component here. Awesome. All right, so that is one way to pass in props. Much like everything we learned, there are multiple ways to do the same thing. Oh, did you have a question, Mike?
Yes. So I see it's a dictionary, but the definition of the dictionary, where is that being defined at? Are we defining it here, or are we defining it in the profile? Because if we can just pass in anything here, then, and on the other side for the profile, we're using that. So I guess I answered it. So the dictionary is being defined in the here.
Yes, pretty much. So this is an important point and a good thing to remember. You need to know what exactly you've identified in your dictionary for your keys. Because when you come in here, if I were to do props dot like URL instead of image, it will not find that. It looks like it's okay, but when we pull up now, it doesn't have anything in here. It doesn't have a value for, oh, and it's gone. Look at that, just completely disappeared because URL does not exist as a key that we've passed in there. So this is whatever you've defined within these components, props where you're passing it in is what will be in that dictionary to go ahead and grab the value for. So React will let you put whatever you want in here, but it won't grab it unless if it's named the same as what you passed in. Do you have any further questions or?
No, ma'am. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Making sure we're all following, because I know this can be a little interesting here. Also, we're having to dust off JavaScript and HTML after how long of not using it. So yeah. Okay, so this was one way to pass in props. You can simply just have props up here and then pull it out by grabbing the keys. But there's another way to go ahead and get props. Now in the README, I'm going to pull this out. This right here, this probably looks kind of confusing and not like what you've seen yet. A little different. Ignore it for now. We're going to come back to it later because we can see this is class profile extends, and we are working in a function, not a class. So we're going to talk about that a little later. So just skip over that if you're following along in the README. We will discuss that in a minute, but for now, we're going to talk about destructuring props. So we've talked about passing props, and I'm going to show you how to destructure them now in what we're working in here. So this is simply passing it. It's great, but we can make this a little bit cleaner so we don't have to keep doing the props dot key to access everything that we need. So how we would do that here is we know we're passing in a name and an image URL. So we can come, instead of passing in props, we can take this out and we can put in curly brackets, name and image URL. And look, it already knew that. Typically there's spaces here just for readability, but the spacing doesn't matter. But I can pass in the exact names of the keys that we are passing in the props. And this is, if you hover over, see, it says destructured elements. This way now, instead of doing props .name to access that value, we can simply just put Nick. And then same with image URL. So this is another way you can pass in props. And this is called destructuring. It's taking everything that we're packaging up here and identifying it up here in our function parameters. And then you can just grab it like that. Easy. So other than that, there's another way we can destructure as well. So there are 3 ways to pass in props. There's just props. There's identifying the keys up here in the function parameters. And then there's also coming down here within the function body and assigning the props to variable names. So here we would do, again, we'll do a constant because it's JavaScript, and we curly brackets outside of props. And we're going to assign name, if I can type, name and image URL are going to be equal to props. So this is another way to destructure inside the function body itself, similar to before when we destructured within the parameters. You can just grab it by the new variable name we've assigned to it. Cool. So the great thing about this, passing props, let's see, I'm gonna split screen here. And with this, we're gonna watch now as we can watch how this dynamically works. So I've got one profile in there, but I wanna use profile again. But this time we'll change it to somebody else's name. We're gonna pass in Sean. We're going to keep the same placeholder, but see, we can keep using the same component, but we're passing in different props to get rendered into our HTML there. And we can keep going. So the great thing about reusing components. Any questions so far? All right, pretty easy to follow along with how these pass down. Let's see, so what do we got next? We have in the README built-in props. That is what we were already covering here, the destructuring by identifying it within the parameter up here. Just making sure I cover everything on props before we go into our extra example. Oh yes, so another thing important to note is we can also, we don't have to just pass in information. Sorry. We don't have to pass in just static things here. We can also pass, you can pass functions in props. So I'm going to just make a clicking button, I guess, underneath. Let's make a button here. Click me. And okay, so we have a button. Right now it doesn't do anything because we haven't told it to do anything, but I'm going to show how we can pass function into the profile from here. So same as, let's see, go ahead and spin this out here. We're going to, so our button, oh my gosh, I can't decide where I want to land. Our button needs an on-click function, right? So we're just going to create an on-click handler, I guess, for our function. Let's see. We'll do on-click handler. And this is E for event, which is listening for the click, right? Way back to when we were doing our event listeners. dig deep in the memories. So we're listening for that event. When that event happens, we're going to do this. We are going to just send an alert. You clicked it. Congratulations. All right. So I can pass this onClick handler function as a prop. So let's go ahead and do that. This is if we have multiple, it's kind of a bad example because that would be ridiculous to pass it into 3 different ones, the same thing. You should build that into your component if it's a, repeated action. But we're going to say this is unique to me. My profile is going to have this. So we're going to call this on click is going to equal the on click handler. So now we can see is grab this function, and when we hover over it, it shows it's a function here, and it's going to pass it down into our profile. So now in props, we should also have an on click as well, because we're passing on click here is the name and that function. So now within this package of props, we should be able to have this. I personally like to we're going to do this. I like to put these right here, so I don't have any extra down here in the code. Okay, so now we can come to this button, and it's going to have its on click. Oops. Yep, that's right. Is going to equal that function we passed in. And you can name it differently if this is confusing. But so now if everything's working as is, this function right here came from the props being passed in, which came from here. This is the props we're passing in, which said that this function right here is what's going to happen for the button. So when I click it, it should alert. And it did. It says, yay, you clicked me. So you can pass pretty much anything as props into another component. All right. Any questions on props, passing props into another component?
I sometimes get confused if I'm supposed to put the function in the main apps JX or in the specific component file.
So functions you would put, and this will kind of be a design choice. If I had a click me button that I wanted to alert every time somebody clicked it, I would probably put it in the component. Now, do you mean within the function body or the return, or do you mean within app, JSX, or the profile?
Yeah, I mean, which of the files to put it in. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So your component, you will put everything in there that you want same across the board. But if for some reason you had a profile that had a button that you didn't want to alert when you clicked it, you should have that outside that component somewhere else. Because the idea is that we are going to reuse this. So anything in here will be across the board. There's no changing this, but there is changing out here and what we pass into it, if that makes sense. So let's see another example. Trying to think. In terms of profile. Gosh, I can't think of a good example with profile that we would want differently between pages here. But okay, so stupid example still is this click me button. Let's say with Sean's component, I didn't want to do a you clicked it. I wanted to do a, let's see, we're going to do a different alert that says oh gosh, it's all caps. It's going to yell at us. You shouldn't click this. So now Why is this being weird?
Probably because you have two
yeah,
the same.
On-click handler 2. Don't name it like this. Be better than me. This is purely for demonstrative purposes. Okay, so I now have 2 ways this button can be clicked. So that is when I would have these out here because I have 2 different things happening and I want to make sure that Sean's component, oh my gosh, it's still caps. I thought I turned it off. Sean's component is going to get this second function. So now when I click his, it'll say you shouldn't click this. When I click mine, I clicked it.
Okay, so if it was something that you always wanted to happen on every single one, then you would put it in the profile.jsx?
Correct. So if I wanted everybody to click it and see this, I would move it into here. So
Okay.
that way when I call this, and then you wouldn't even have to pass it in as a prop. Then you just have all this gone. We're going to take that out because that's mean. And I'm going to take that out as well. And we're going to move it all in here. So again, anything JavaScript is going to go up top, not in the return. Do not put it in your return. It comes up here, all your logic. So here we have our on-click handler. Again, we're not passing in any prop called on-click. We could take that out. So now our on-click function is here. We'll change this to be on-click handler. Now every component will render with this function for their button. Clicked it, clicked it. So that was a good question. And again, like I said, it's a design choice, but you just want to make sure that whatever's in your component, you want identical across the board. Okay, any other questions on props and passing in props? Now that we've called it parameters, is it a little less scary? And this is, okay, so we have just one component in here. So that's kind of nice and easy. I think we'll keep doing one component for an example. One thing I do want to touch on that shows in the README, again, I'm going to pull it out here now so we could just look at this. When you come down to, oh, conditional rendering, that's right. We were going to do that too. Never mind, let's do that real quick. And then we'll go back to the last little bit. So we learned a little bit about conditional rendering with components, right? How you can do, just show this component if there's an image URL. So now we're going to do something when we pull up, so we pull this up, we see this picture is broken. It's not working. When I inspect it, let's see, I don't know. I don't like it. It doesn't work, doesn't look good. I want to only show that image if something exists there. So I want that to happen across the board. I don't want it special for just one or another. I want all profiles to have this functionality where if this image does not exist, don't show it. Just get rid of it. So here we can do conditional rendering too. We would do this down here with the image. And the README kind of gives you the README is wrong, actually. The way it does this, let's look at it, see why this is wrong. Okay. So because this is an expression, because we're doing a conditional rendering JavaScript expression here, we're doing like a ternary operator, right? We're doing that. Is this true? If so, do this. Otherwise, do that, right? Ternary in JavaScript. Again, dig deep back to the early days of this class. So what I want to happen is I want it to say, is this true? If so, go ahead and set that image source to this image URL we're passing in, which it's not. Mine's image URL. Image. Okay. I'm gonna have to change all of these because I did it differently. But and if this is not true, then just don't do anything. So what is wrong with this? Can somebody tell me? With my logic, I'll give you that hint.
Well, the only thing I see is like basically if you have an image URL by saying image URL, and if the image URL's length equals 0, then you want to set the image. But if the length is 0, then you don't have an image URL.
Right, exactly. Yep,
So it's
that's
backwards.
it. So we're gonna say if it's
Not equal. Or what does
greater
that
than.
mean? Oh, greater than 1.
So yes, if there's an image URL, so if we've got a URL passed in as props and that length of that URL is greater than 0, then we're going to set our image source to that URL. And we have to do this tag here. We're going to do that. Okay, that's the whole expression there. Otherwise, we're just going to not do anything, basically, or null. So let's take a look if that did anything. I don't know if it will, because I think it's still, we're getting an image URL. It's just the URL's broken. Yeah. But let's go ahead and not pass in anything. And now let's see what happens when we pull that back up. Where is it? Oh, look at that. We can see it is gone. Our conditional rendering is working because I passed in nothing for the image URL. So it came here and okay, so now we can also, that will not work. I'll have to do a trim. Anyways, that is what we wanted it to do. It looks like we're trying to pass in something. So it might exist, but the length is not greater than 0. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. So we're going to do nothing. We're not going to make this image tag in our HTML, basically. But we can see with Sean's that did have that URL still. His is still creating that tag right there. Any questions on this conditional rendering? Again, if you want to use JavaScript ternary expressions like this, make sure you wrap it in your curly brackets, and then you can totally do that. No questions? Okay. So now we'll go back to, I think that was the last thing in the README that we missed. Yeah, well, that was the destructuring. This is the ternary, again, condition, yes or no. Here is finally, because it's at the end, we're talking about class-based versus functional components. So we are going to be using functional components. When we write a component, it's going to say export default function. However, some legacy applications use class-based, and it's seems kind of backwards, you'd think, because OOP is real big, which uses classes. But React, it's no. Because when you use class-based components, they don't use the same things as functional components. So this use state, well, the state I think stays the same, but the use effect. You're going to be learning something soon next week, I think, called use effect. And that changes. You can't do use effect in class-based. And it's a little bit more difficult. You do some extra stuff on top of it. So we and the majority of contemporary coders use functional based components. But if you work in some older React apps, you may see class-based components. So this is just here to kind of show you the difference. So basically with a class, again, you're going to identify it as a class. And classes extend from this React component. And something different about classes is you can't just return the JSX. You need to render before anything else is done. So they have this little render thrown in here. But then from there on, it kind of looks very similar. You have your logic done up here, and then you return your JSX down there. And it says that down here. Class-based require that render to show JSX. And they extend this component. So that's kind of the main differences visually. Functionally, there's some differences, but if you get placed on an app that is class-based, just look in the documentation and it will tell you how to use different things for it. But we are going to teach off of functional components. All right, any questions there? We don't spend too much time on it because we're not going to teach class-based. Okay. If there are no questions, I am going to stop the recording. All right. Let me stop.